Morning, everybody. How we doing today? Today is a big day in world history. One of the biggest elections that any of us have seen in our lifetime, or probably any lifetime, is wrapping up today. And in truth, we probably won't know the ending of this thing for a week, if we're lucky. And it's just a shame to see the great ideologies of democracy being so trampled underfoot. And all the ways they cut corners and just misuse the system, and the gerrymandering of regions to win votes. It's just so corrupt and so disgusting and so ugly. And I've said before, the outcome of the election is not going to change a lot of things. It's not going to change what the CIA is doing, who they're funding, what governments they're trying to overthrow, what regions they're trying to stabilize versus destabilize. None of that international policy changes much under presidencies left and right. And the American left and right are both right of center. You know, there's no left in this country. There's no extreme left. Bernie Sanders, who's even really a non-entity, he's left of center, but he's not this extreme left that the American politics would have us believe. And yet his belief systems are so scary that even the American left dismisses him, because it would challenge the status quo too much. It would change things too much to redistribute taxes into other areas of need and human resources, would take away from the corporate dollar and their agenda and interests. And like I said, the outcome of the election is not going to change foreign policy. It's not going to change who the CIA is trying to topple, trying to stabilize, what regions they're trying to infiltrate and get rid of a government that's now in place, or put a new one in place to allow their economic policies to exist. The election doesn't change any of that. The president doesn't really have the power. Even under Obama, with all his liberal ideologies, there was still plenty of war to be had and drones dropping death from the sky. Presidents don't impact the grand scope of the corporate economic agenda. What they do reflect is the viewpoints of the American people, and the disconnect from the global society, the disconnect from the human tradition, the human experience, the united understanding of our shared migration. It's something that education gives us a perspective on. And the more educated we become, the broader our empathy becomes, and the more inconvenient our opinions become to the elite and their machinations and how they want to manufacture and maneuver global policy and economics. So dumb, distracted people staring at a screen is just fine with them. And I can tell you by first-hand experience, my two stepkids are 10th and 12th grade, and their curriculum is so dumbed down. And listen to these students talk on their distance learning right now. These kids are not smart. They're not smart. I'm not talking about my kids. I'm talking about the kids in the classes. The things they talk about are just so. It's the memes that they see on social media are the informer of this generation. They don't have a scope politically, globally, but one of them could start a meme, and the rest of them will finish it with them in unison. Because that's the universal educator. That's the thing they've all learned together, and they can all laugh about that little stupid 2-second meme they saw that's relatable to them and their reality, but so disconnected from the real reality. And the more miseducated and disinformed voters we have, the less democracy works. And in the absence of understanding and empathy, lives fear and hate. And fear and hate are very easy tools for empires to manipulate throughout time and history. They want us to be dumb, scared, afraid, ready to hate, because it allows them to change our viewpoints and shift how we think about regions and people effortlessly to manipulate their own economic agendas. We'll hate brown one week, black the next week, green the next week. You know what I mean? It doesn't matter religion, race, color, continent. Their media will shape for us who we should be afraid of and leery of and weary and worried about. So this election it's going to tell the world a lot about the American people. And it's certainly concerning. It's certainly been a crazy 4 years. 2020 is a year that no one will ever forget. This pandemic, the riots, the looting, the outrages, the protests. It's just been a year of chaos, a year of the rich getting richer. And history should warn us all, saying whenever we see the rich getting richer, they're squeezing the poor to do so. And they're squeezing more of the remaining middle class to do so. Again, I'm not going to focus on this too long. I played the Armstrong, What a Wonderful World, for a reason. Because I want us to remember that it is a wonderful world and a blessed life. And when we can disconnect from the stress and the chaos and the disinformation and the unharmonious viewpoints that the media needs us to be outraged and divided through every day, if we can turn that off and remember what Armstrong says, I see trees of green, and see the beauty that still exists even here in America. It's a land of beautiful people and beautiful vistas. It's just a very disinformed people. It's a very distracted people. And into that fray has settled in a certain entitlement that comes with imperialism. And that entitlement is a dangerous thing. A third generation immigrant has a certain degree of, I've earned this, I don't have to do nothing to get it. And those people seem to be the easiest to sway. They're kind of a spoiled kid mentality. They don't want to work hard. They just think, well, I'm a white American, I should have this life handed to me. They don't want to even acknowledge the struggle of the other groups in this country. They don't want to see white privilege because it's incriminating. You know, it acknowledges a really ugly history. But in spite of all that, Armstrong says, what a wonderful world. So let's look at this day, hope for a good outcome. Hope that regardless of what happens, in a week's time we can have an answer and move forward. But that's like the least likely scenario from everything I've seen and read. It seems like this thing's going to drag out for months and go into the courts, and we're just going to have a mess. And when there's chaos of this nature, it's easy to rob the banks. If the cops are all busy dealing with a protest or a riot, what a great time to rob a bank. And I'm gonna predict right now, the rich are gonna take this moment of us in chaos, and out of it's gonna come another great robbing. And I've seen that the number of billionaires on the planet this year has doubled. You know, there's been this real increase of the wealth among the uber elite, and we got to be careful, keep our eyes open, because they'll pass legislation while we ain't looking, or that we misread, and we'll give away the keys to our own village. We're not a smart people. We're distracted people. We're an entitled people. We're not smart people. I'll move on. First thing I want to talk about is one of the great records of 1960s jazz. And it's a record that was a rebirth of sorts for the great Sonny Rollins. And he had gone on one of his sabbaticals. Ornette Coleman and John Coltrane were kind of pushing the envelope in certain ways. Giant Steps was this incredible opus by Coltrane that probably in some levels challenged Rollins, and he had to figure out what his next move was going to be. And Rollins took some time off, and there's the famous image of him sitting on the Queensboro Bridge over the East River, sitting there practicing the saxophone hours upon a time in the isolation of the roar of the city below him, New York City off to the west, Queens to the east, and he's sitting there just playing. The rumble of the train tracks, the roar of the automobiles, the steamships and the diesel ships and the tugboats. New York is a cacophony of sound, and Rollins was just sitting there practicing to it and playing to it and finding almost an ambiance from the city itself. You had the bass of the clatter of the machines operating in Brooklyn. You had the percussion, the sounds. There's this pulse to the city that it feels like it gives them a kind of a new center, a new calm, empathetic breathiness. Even his tone seems a little bit more laid back. And okay, I don't need to match Coltrane and go into the same regions as him. I need to be Sonny Rollins. I need to find myself. And this bridge record is just a wonderful opus. Jim Hall, who a lot of collectors love, I'm going to guess 90% of them come to Jim Hall through this album. And Hall is fantastic on this. One of the great jazz guitar players. Mostly a West Coast guy, but he gets session work all over. And he's truly a great player. And his color on this session is just, I'm going to say, breathtaking. The bridge is a wonderful comeback for Rollins. It really finds him in a new place, a new tone, a new attitude. And I think his tonal change is the most interesting thing. He just seems calm. He seems serene. Like the chaos of New York City almost settles him. As this calm eye of the storm sitting here on the Queensboro Bridge. I'm pretty sure it was a Queensboro. Was the Manhattan? No, I think it was the Queensboro Bridge. But he's sitting there just playing along to the pulse of the city. I guess he did it in good weather and bad weather, just in isolation, completely out of the scene. And his return is just triumphant. And he signs with RCA, which was a pretty big coup in and of itself. RCA is not a renowned jazz label. Capitol has a better history with jazz than RCA does. Columbia is the big label that really does jazz and does jazz well. And I'm sure RCA has seen some of the success that Columbia is having with Miles Davis, and Monk's just joined Columbia as well. There's plenty of stuff at Brubeck's going on. Mingus has some cutting edge stuff. The Jazz Messengers, Donald Byrd, Gigi Grice. Columbia's doing some real jazz in 57, 58, 59, 60. And so when Rollins is coming back on the scene, RCA snatches him up. And I'll be honest, I have a hard time thinking of other black jazz musicians on RCA. Most of the stuff I can think of is white, and the Vic subsidiary maybe has a couple things, but it's not a jazz label in its soul. And this is a great jazz record. It's probably easily the best jazz record on RCA. I'd have to look a little closer, but when I look at my labels and I have things sorted by label, which I don't right now, it's alphabetized right now. It helped with some episodes I was doing this past summer, but I often have my label on my record collection sorted by jazz labels, and like 500 Blue Notes and Prestige and Riversides and all these big selections. And even my Columbia is 300. Capitol is probably close to 100. RCA is probably 30, 40 titles, and most of it's white stuff. And that's not to say I'm not missing some great stuff. I actually am looking for Freddie Green record on RCA that is just not out there. Tough to find. There's reissues of it, but I'd like to find the original RCA of that. But it's not a label that's doing cutting edge jazz. And this isn't really cutting edge. It's just beautiful. It's Jim Hall's doing his thing. You know, I think Bob Cranshaw's on the bass, Ben Riley or H.T. Saunders is on the drums, and it's produced by Bob Prince, who's not even a name I can tell you anything about. George Avakian writes the liner notes. But wonderful record. And he makes 4 or 5 more records on RCA in the early 60s, and they're not all as strong as this. Some of them are a little bit more watered down, but the one with Coleman Hawkins is great. The Bossa Nova one's a little bit shticky. They're all solid in their own way, but this is really one of the highlights of the great Sonny Rollins career. And it's been issued with other covers. I have another cover of this where it's got the bridge on the cover, and it's all kind of this moody picture of the Brooklyn Bridge. But this is the original cover, and it's not that tough to come by because it's sold pretty well, and it's been reissued plenty of times as well. So it's definitely a record you should seek out if you're looking for jazz royalty, as it were. Next thing I want to talk about real quick is I mentioned a little bit ago about Bethlehem and their bass players. And I figured I would just document that for you guys so you could see how many they chose to work with. And it wasn't like Gus Wilde had this affinity for bass players. It was as a young label looking for recording artists. Bass players happened to be the guys that most often didn't have contracts as recording leaders. And so when you look at Bethlehem's discography from the mid-50s, they're kind of scraping and searching, looking for their stable of musicians. And they start off very much as an East Coast entity. And Oscar Pettiford's like one of the real backdrops to what they're doing. He's a great bass player, one of the most innovative bass players. He's actually a mixed Native American, black descendant. He is a kind of diminutive fella with a strong presence and a beautiful tone. And he's also one of the first guys to play the cello in jazz as well. But Pettiford was a character, and his life was cut short. I think he dies in 59 or 60, which is rather sad. But he's kind of the backdrop of the East Coast Bethlehem sound. He's playing on a lot of the records and sessions, and they give him 3 records as a leader. Number 10,003, 1003. It's a 10-inch, the third 10-inch, obviously, in Bethlehem's discography. Interesting, it's Burt Goldblatt artwork, I believe it is. You can see the strings of the bass and the hands plucking away at it. Bethlehem has a wonderful inner label, that red, beautiful color. A little laurel up on the top. And Bethlehem is kind of looking for their roster. And they're getting some old swing guys, you know, Hank D'Amico, sorry. They're taking guys from those groups. What's the trumpet player's name? I can't think of it right now. Oh, man. Anyway, he plays a lot of stuff on Capitol. Slipped to my tongue. I'll come to it later. But Pettiford's kind of an anchor of the whole East Coast Bethlehem sound. On this 10-inch, he's playing with Julius Watkins on the French horn, Charlie Rouse, Duke Gordon, and Ron Jefferson. So this is almost a jazz mode record, which is Watkins and Charlie Rouse together. Duke Jordan on the piano. That's interesting. I kind of had forgotten that they were on this. And the jazz modes make a couple of great records on the Dawn label, and then they make a couple of great records on the Atlantic label, and then Charlie Rouse eventually goes to work with Monk. But really interesting stuff, interesting instrumentation, and the French horn really adds a nice tone to a jazz LP. I'm guessing that's a Pettiford and the cello right there. It almost sounds like a guitar, but I don't see guitar listed here at all. So it's probably Pettiford playing the cello. Beautiful stuff. Beautiful stuff. And these records are pretty tough to find, but they are out there. 1019, so 16 records later, is the second Pettiford 10-inch on Bethlehem. And it's called basically Duke. And they're pretty much playing Duke arrangements. I think I got a Burt Goldblatt cover. Indeed it is. A wonderful purple toned image. Beautiful stuff. If you can't tell what that is, it's a bunch of guys in the studio recording. I believe this is a bigger group here. Pettiford, Clark Terry, Joe Wilder, Jimmy Cleveland, Jimmy Hamilton, Davey Schildkraut, Danny Bank on the baritone, and Earl Knight on the piano. So it's an octet. What a great group. Terry, Wilder, Jimmy Cleveland, my goodness. Jimmy Cleveland, for those who don't remember, is one of the best trombone players in the world. He's mind-blowingly good. So there's basically Duke 10-inch. They're playing Ellington compositions, and Pettiford's just in that tone. He's just loud and in the mix and taking charge, taking names. It's a nice track selection as well. Jack the Bear, Tomo Paz, Swing Until the Girls Come Home, Mood Indigo, Time on My Hands, and Chuckles, which is a Clark Terry arrangement. But Terry Pryor wrote that when he was with Ellington. I wonder if Joe Wilder played with Duke for a while too. It's possible. But that's a great piece, and you can probably find it for $40-50. The 10 inches on Bethlehem have a rareness that makes them desirable, but they're not super in demand because they're not very well known, and so that kind of leads to them not being too expensive because there's just not a demand for them. This is Oscar Pettiford's third record for Bethlehem. Now it's a 12-inch B33, so it's the 33rd 12-inch in the Bethlehem series, probably 1956 now, and again, wonderful stuff. And on this session, he's got Gigi Grice, Jerome Richardson, O.C. Johnson, Don Abney, Ernie Royal, Donald Byrd, and Bobby Brookmeyer. That's a pretty serious group. Byrd and Royal both on the trumpet, Brookmeyer on the trombone, alto clarinet Gigi Grice, tenor and clarinet Jerome Richardson, and then Abney and Johnson on the piano and drums. Pretty nuts. Pretty high level groups that Bethlehem's allowed to put together here, in part because they're having a leader as a bass player, and they can sign him because he's not under contract, and he can bring in the sidemen that he wants. And so it was a clever way for Bethlehem to build this great language of albums without having the great roster of musicians. Next guy, and then just to be clear, when Bethlehem first launches the 12-inch BCP series in 1955, they couple up some of the Pettiford 10 inches on 12 inches. This one's with the Red Mitchell, and this one's with the Vinnie Burke, which are both bass player 10 inches as well, which I will show you next. This is the Vinnie Burke 10 inch, number 1010. And Vinnie Burke is a great bass player. He plays a lot with the East Coast White Cats, some of the West Coast White Cats. The guys like the Brookmeyers and the Zoot Sims and Jimmy Rainey. Vinnie Burke's played a lot with those kind of cats. Burke is a great leader. He gets a couple records on ABC as well. And Vinnie Burke's a guy people should dig into. He's a really great player, and his name shows up on a lot of session work, and is certainly a notable part of jazz bass royalty. Again, a great Burke Gold Black cover. And this one features Ronnie Odrich on the clarinet, Joe Cinderella on the guitar. I'm a big Joe Cinderella guy. And on the accordion is Don Burns, along with Vinnie Burke on the bass. And interestingly, they dropped the E on his last name back here for some reason. I'm not sure why they would do that. But East Coast number 2, Jazz Series, BCP 1010. Fun stuff. And then that was coupled up with the Pettiford Duke record to make this record. Nope, wrong. This one. So this number, Bethlehem 6, B6, is 1010 and 10-3. So you don't need to have this if you have these. Conversely, if you have these, then technically you got those. And then the other one, listen to Joe Cinderella. And so then this one is the Duke session along with this Red Mitchell session. The accordion's interesting, isn't it? You don't think it's going to work, but it does. Matt Matthews comes to mind, the great Dutch accordion player who plays some great records on the Dawn label. Dawn and Bethlehem have this interesting kind of simpatico. They have similar rosters, similar styles, innovative, modern, post-bop, white jazz, meant for white audiences. There's some really good stuff in both labels. This is Happy Miners, Red Mitchell with Bobby Brookliner and Zoot Sims. And Red Mitchell's a great bass player. He has the red-headed Irish descent in him. You see him a lot on the Contemporary label out west. He's doing a lot of great session work out there. But that also meant he was available to be hired as a leader. And I've spoken about Bethlehem a lot over the years. And Bethlehem, in the need to find new artists, eventually opens a West Coast office. And when they open that West Coast office, they start hiring all the great West Coast session players. And so that includes your Red Mitchells and your Conti Condolis and your Charlie Marianos, Stu Williamson, Claude Williamson, all those cats, Frank Rosalino. They all got Bethlehem Records. I've talked about it many times, Stan Levy, and of course Max Bennett is another great bass player. And Max Bennett kind of anchors that West Coast modern post-bop white grouping. All those guys I just mentioned, Max Bennett plays bass on almost all those records. Almost all of them. And so there's this great West Coast group of Bethlehem guys, and I've talked about it many times, that make about a dozen 10 inches and a few 12 inches that are really outstanding, hard-driving, modern jazz that should not be ignored. If you don't know Stu Williamson and Charlie Mariano and Frank Rosalino, those guys will blow hard. You'll think they're listening to Fuller, Mobley, and Morgan. Those guys play. This is one of the great Max Bennett 10 inches, and had a great album cover. It's got an interesting title to it. Hence, home, you idle creatures. Get you home and lend an ear to Max Bennett. It's got the zebras on the cover. Very, very cool. Very tough to come by. And this Red Mitchell is also very tough to come by. And Bethlehem didn't reissue all their 10 inches. They reissue about 18 of the 38. And so it means a lot of the Bethlehem 10 inch stuff is only available if you get the 10 inch. Which was partly why I started collecting the Bethlehem 10 inches, because there was no other way to get the stuff. Max Bennett's great. It sounds like probably Rosalino right there, I'm going to guess. Indeed it is. Again, the lineup on this is Max Bennett with Charlie Mariano, one of the great alto players ever, Stan Levy, Claude Williamson, Frank Rosalino, and then Helen Carr sings on a couple tracks, and she's a great singer. Really outstanding, but tough to find. Max Bennett gets 2 more records on the BCP series. They come out in real quick succession, B48 and then B50. And the lineups on these are both outstanding as well. Max Bennett, Carl Fontana's on the trombone, Mel Lewis, Dave McKenna, Charlie Mariano, Jack Nimitz, and Nick Travis on that one. And on this one, Rosalino doing his thing. Max Bennett, Charlie Mariano, Frank Rosalino, or Carl Fontana, Claude Williamson, Stan Levy, Helen Carr shows up in a couple tracks on this one as well. Both great records. And then Max Bennett actually goes to Europe and spent a lot of years in Europe playing with the greats over there. And so you're seeing Bethlehem was really being kept vital and was a huge part of the scene, in no small part to all the great bass players that they hired. And then another one we got to mention is the great Milt Hinton. Milt Hinton is part of the great rhythm section with Barry Galbraith and O.C. Johnson and Hank Jones. Those 4 recorded many sessions as rhythm sections. Sometimes they'd have 3 or 4 sessions in a day, going around different New York studios, backing up everything from pop songs to soda commercials to great jazz records. They were in high demand, and it probably means that those 4 don't get as much jazz recognition as they deserve, because they were so in demand doing everything. But Milt Hinton's number BC10 is another example of a fantastic bass player getting a lead session on Bethlehem. And here we have AJ Scatia on the clarinet, Skaja. I'm not sure how you say that, honestly. Milt Hinton, Dick Katz on the piano, and O.C. Johnson's on the bass, on the drums, I mean. Another tough record to find. And this one actually does have a 10-inch version of it that was issued with, this has a couple extra tracks on it if I recall, but it's got the same cover. And then this is a 7-inch version of it. And the only Bethlehem 10-inch I don't have is this number, I think it's 1020 or 1019, 1021. It's right in there somewhere. And it's pretty much, I have the 7-inch and the 12-inch. And the only time I've seen the 10-inch, if I recall, it was really expensive. But if I recall, almost every time I've seen what's supposed to be BCP, I'm sorry, that Bethlehem 1020 10-inch, it's ended up being the 12-inch. So there's a possibility the 10-inch doesn't even exist. Again, because they have the same cover, I've looked at buying numerous versions of the 10-inch, only to find that it was actually the 12-inch, and they had listed it. And I think there's some confusion there. And so I'm actually looking for some clarity on that myself. I haven't looked in a little bit for the 10-inch version, so I should probably take another look. But I'm not buying records right now anyway. But and then the last guy we got to cover here is in 1957. They bring one more legendary bass player into the fold, and that's Charlie Mingus. And he makes 3 records on Bethlehem here, and it's a slightly later generation than the Burke, Bennett, Pettiford, Milt Hinton, Max Bennett stuff. This is a bit towards the end of the Bethlehem's great run, but this fantastic record here, Experiments of Charlie Mingus, is fantastic. It's now got the later 50s logo vinyl. Mingus is a really interesting character. I don't gotta tell most of you that. He's a really great composer and arranger, and really his strong suit. He's a fine bass player. You know, no one's diminishing him as a bass player, but he's famous not for being a bass player. He's famous for his composition, his arrangements, his fiery temperament, pretty much being an asshole. My friend Wolfgang, I was often saying him too hard on Miles and don't acknowledge when other people are assholes. And yet I've said numerous times how much of an asshole Charlie Mingus was. But he was so brilliant that he still was able to attract a lot of great talent around him, and really has a litany of the great players over the years. John LaPorte is playing with him on this. Taylor Macero, who ends up producing Miles in the 60s. Thad Jones is on the trumpet here. Jackson Wiley and Clem DeRose is on the drums. So Jackson Wiley's playing cello, interesting. But it's a fun record. Interesting instrumentation, and you really can't talk to Charlie Mingus without acknowledging Duke Ellington, because he's very much in the Ellington school of arrangement and composition, just with a slightly more acidic take on it. I don't think Mingus was a very happy, he was a pretty angry guy. And so I think a lot of his tension and release, counter movement stuff, it's all revealing his personality. And Ellington was a much more laid back, probably more fun to be around guy. Even though Ellington was very reserved and you didn't really get to know him super well, I would still rather spend an hour in an elevator stuck with Ellington than 10 minutes with Mingus. I think Mingus on a bad day, well, he pulled pistols on people. That tells you all you need to know. In 1958, I believe, he recorded, maybe 57 still. This is East Coasting. This is actually a reissue that came out probably about 10 years ago. And it's the one Bethlehem bass player record I don't have an original pressing of. It's a fine sounding pressing though. I think it was an imported one, if I recall. As most of you know, I'm not a real pressing guy. I care about the music and the artwork. And who did this pressing? Get Back. So I think that's American, Get Back. No, it actually says it's Italian, made in Italy. But great cover. I'd like to find an original copy eventually. This has the great Jimmy Knepper on trombone, who him and Mingus had a lot of issues. Shafi Hadi on the alto, Clarence Shaw on the trumpet, Danny Richmond, who became a staple of Mingus for 15 years, Danny Richmond, and Bill Evans on the piano, believe it or not. Recorded in August '57 in New York City. It's a beautiful record, honestly. Clarence Shaw plays some beautiful trumpet on this. That was very Miles Davis like there a second ago. That's East Coasting. This is called the West Coast Ghost right here. The last thing I want to show you today is Mingus's third record at Bethlehem. And you're already starting to hear there's so much Ellington right there. Knepper's a brilliant player. And remember, he's already done Pithecanthropus at Atlantic at this point. So he's already kind of established how broad his sound is going to be. And his last record here on Bethlehem, also probably from 57, 58. And this has a pretty expansive lineup on it, which again is shades of Ellington. He's comfortable in a small setting, but he's just as comfortable organizing and arranging a big group. And this has Mingus, Richmond, Jimmy Knepper, Shafi Hadi, Bill Hardman on the Nurog. What the fuck is a Nurog? Clarence Shaw, Horace Parlan. Oh, that's a track, sorry. Bob Hammer. So, and there's some interesting like narrated parts in this, almost like street poetry. It's got a real New York feel to it somehow. I'm not exactly sure what that means, but it just feels like the beatniks and the personalities of the village seem very much to be revealed in some of the poetry and the vibes in this record. So it's interesting to see how Bethlehem relied on bass players to flesh out their early discography, because most of those guys weren't signed elsewhere. It's not like they weren't in demand, highly sought after bass players. They all were, but they all didn't have contracts as leaders. And so when Bethlehem was looking for those guys that they could sign as leaders, bass players were the available guys. And they also do some drummers. You know, Charlie Persip gets a couple records. There's a couple other drummers that got records too, like my mind I can't think of right now. They hire some flute players, a couple guitar players, more peripheral side guys in most other settings. There are a lot of guys who get the leadership roles at the great Bethlehem label. And Bethlehem is such a great ghost label. They're there in the shadows with some of the great black and white players of this time frame, with unconventional leaders at the helm, making some really great music. You know, Bethlehem's really a hidden treasure that is collectible, great artwork, it's desirable, it's a great listen every time. It's never too fluffy or too watered down. Their level of credibility, there's no greatest hits, there's no collections, there's no Christmas records. It's very high integrity, this jazz label. And of course, Creed Taylor was part of this early on, before he goes to ABC and then launches Impulse. So he's cutting his teeth here as well with these very musicians. And Bethlehem was having its greatest success with singers like Chris Connor. That was kind of where their bread and butter was. And then later Nina Simone, she comes along. And Bethlehem also hires just this huge list of singers. Most of them are very anonymous to today's artists, to today's collectors. We don't know these names very well, but there's a long list of Bethlehem singers that got one or two records as a leader. And it's because singers were easy to find. It wasn't that hard to go around and find a few singers that weren't hired. But finding great saxophone players, that's not that easy. They were all signed up. Great trumpet players were all signed up. Great piano players were mostly signed up. Singers, they're easy to find. Lots of them in every nightclub in the country at that point. And so there's really a great selection of stuff at Bethlehem that covers a pretty wide range of stuff. And there's often Max Bennett or Oscar Pettiford anchoring a lot of those records as bass sidemen, but they do great records as leaders as well. And so there's 6 bass players in that 5-year window at Bethlehem, all making records as leaders. And most of the great jazz labels who spent twice as long in the business don't have that many records by bass players. It's pretty nuts. Probably 12, 14 records here by bass players as leaders at the Bethlehem label. And that's something I think only having the entire discography of the label kind of allowed me to see. I think that's really interesting how many bass players got leadership roles here. And so having that full body of work by a label does give you insight into things that you would not see otherwise. If someone ever comes across the 10-inch of this, please message me and let me know. Again, this one's B10, this one's just a 7-inch. There's a 1020, I think it is. I have to double check that. But there's a 10-inch version of this with the exact same cover that I'd like to have just to complete it out. But I also don't want to spend big money on it because I already have all the music. So anyway, that's Bethlehem, the bass players, Sonny Rollins, the bridge, and it's election day here in America. Let's hope for a good outcome. Y'all be safe, be blessed. We'll talk to you soon. Peace.